The sign had been there longer than the fence, longer than the drought scars on the land, longer even than Eli Rourke's reputation as the hardest, quietest rancher in 3 counties, a weather-bleached slab of wood nailed crooked to a dead post at the edge of the north pasture. Its letters burned deep and uneven as if carved by a trembling hand. "Don't! That's forbidden!" And everyone who'd grown up within shouting distance of Black Hollow Ranch knew what it meant without ever being told, because some warnings didn't need explaining. They just settled into your bones like cold, and Eli had lived his whole life honoring it, riding his fences wide around that stretch of land, counting his cattle carefully so none wandered too close, pretending not to hear the way the wind behaved differently there, how it seemed to sink instead of blow, how sound died the moment it crossed the invisible line past the sign, swallowing birdsong, hoofbeats, even the low groan of the earth itself. And for 20 years that had been enough, because Eli Rourke was a man who believed that discipline was just fear with better manners. And fear kept things standing, kept his ranch alive after his father drank himself into the grave and his mother, followed from grief, kept Eli alive through fires, floods, and the slow rot of loneliness that came with being the last. Rourke on land nobody wanted to buy and nobody dared trespass on, but discipline cracked the night the screaming started, because screams were different from rumors, different from stories told in low voices, at the feed store or the way old men went quiet when Black Hollow was mentioned. Screams were real, and they came from the forbidden pasture just after midnight, tearing through the dark like something being ripped open, high and raw and desperate, a sound that made Eli bolt upright in bed, with his heart hammering, so hard he thought it might wake the dead, a sound he recognized with a terror so sharp it tasted like metal, because it sounded human, and worse, it sounded familiar, like a voice he'd buried years ago but never forgot. And for a long moment he sat frozen, fists clenched in his sheets, telling himself it was the wind, telling himself it was an animal caught in wire, telling himself that the sign was there for a reason and that crossing that line had ruined men before him. But the scream came again, weaker this time, breaking into sobs, and something inside Eli finally snapped, because fear could keep a man alive, but guilt could resurrect the dead. And he pulled on his boots and coat and grabbed the lantern and rifle without thinking, stepping out into a night so still it felt staged, the stars sharp and watchful, the moon hanging low like it didn't want to see what was about to happen. And as Eli crossed the familiar ground toward the north pasture, memories he'd spent decades burying rose up uninvited, of his younger brother Thomas laughing as they rode side by side, of promises made and broken, of the night Thomas disappeared, past that same sign chasing something he swore he saw moving in the dark, something that shouldn't have been there, and how Eli had stood right where he stood now and yelled for him to come back, how Thomas had turned once, just once, his face pale in the moonlight, fear flickering across it like a shadow passing over a flame, before the darkness swallowed him whole, and how the screams had come then too, echoing until suddenly they didn't, and how the sheriff found nothing. Not a body, not blood, not tracks, just the sign, untouched, as if mocking them all, and how everyone had looked at Eli afterward with a question they never asked out loud, a question Eli asked himself every night since. Why didn't you go after him? And now standing before the sign again with his lantern, casting trembling light across those burned letters, Eli felt time collapse in on itself, the past and present folding together until it felt like this moment had been waiting for him all along, the scream rising again, hoarse and fading, and before his courage could fail him, before discipline could reassert its cold grip, Eli stepped past the sign, and the world changed instantly, the air thickening like he'd walked underwater, the lantern flame shrinking and turning an unhealthy blue, the ground beneath his boots soft and uneven, pulsing faintly as if breathing, and the silence, God, the silence, absolute and crushing, pressing against his ears until his own heartbeat sounded like thunder, and Eli realized with a sick lurch that he could no longer see the fence behind him, the ranch lights gone, the familiar replaced by a landscape that felt wrong in subtle, horrifying ways, trees bending inward as if listening, shadows stretching where no light source existed. And ahead of him, deeper in the forbidden pasture, something moved, not fast, not slow, but deliberately, as if it knew he was there and had always known he would come, and Eli raised his rifle with shaking hands, calling out a name he hadn't spoken in 20 years, his voice sounding muffled and distant even to himself. And when the answer came, it didn't come as a scream this time, but as a whisper carried straight into his skull, a whisper that spoke his name with perfect familiarity and said, "You finally looked." And in that moment, Eli understood the first terrible truth, that the sign wasn't there to keep people out. It was there to keep something in. And he had just opened the door. And as the darkness ahead began to take shape, tall and impossibly thin, wearing the outline of a man but moving like a thought, Eli Rourke realized that whatever waited beyond the forbidden line had been patient, had been watching, and had been waiting for him specifically. And if you're still listening right now, if this story has you leaning closer, heart racing, needing to know what Eli sees next and what unthinkable choice he will make, then don't look away. The thing that stepped forward from the breathing dark wore Thomas's face the way a wound wears a scab, familiar enough to hurt, but wrong enough to make Eli's stomach twist, its limbs stretching a fraction too long with each movement, joints bending where they shouldn't, eyes reflecting the lanterns, blue flame with a depth that suggested corridors instead of pupils. And when it spoke again, it used Thomas's voice perfectly, every cadence intact, every childhood inflection sharpened like a blade, saying Eli's name the way only his brother ever had, half teasing, half pleading, and Eli staggered back, nearly dropping the rifle. Because grief does not prepare you for resurrection, especially not this kind, and the thing smiled, not a human smile, but an imitation assembled from memory, and told him the forbidden pasture was not a place but an agreement, that long before the Rourkes ever branded cattle or built fences, something hungry had settled beneath the land, something that fed on choices and hesitation, something that learned quickly that humans were best harvested not by force, but by guilt. And Thomas, reckless and curious, had crossed the line years ago and offered himself freely by running instead of returning. And Eli's sin had not been cowardice, but patience, because by waiting, by believing the sign more than his brother's screams, he had sealed the bargain, one soul taken cleanly and one left to ripen. And Eli shouted that it was lying, that Thomas was dead, that this thing was just wearing his skin. But the creature only laughed softly and showed him memories no one else could know. The scar on Thomas's shoulder from falling off the barn roof, the promise Eli made to teach him how to shoot, the way Thomas had cried quietly the night their mother died so Eli wouldn't hear. And with every revealed truth, the ground beneath Eli softened further, pulling at his boots, the pasture tightening like a fist. And the creature explained that it could not cross the line on its own, that it needed witnesses, needed someone to look, because being seen made it real, made it stronger. And Eli realized with mounting horror that every story, every warning, every whispered rumor had fed it just enough to survive, but never enough to leave, until now, because Eli had crossed fully, willingly, lantern held high, eyes open, and the creature offered him a choice that felt rehearsed, elegant in its cruelty. Eli could leave, walk back across the invisible boundary, forget everything again, and the ranch would remain intact for another generation. But the screaming would continue, calling to strangers, children, travelers, anyone with a weakness it could exploit, or Eli could stay, could step forward and take Thomas's place, binding himself to the pasture and ending the cycle forever. A final harvest, one last witness who would never leave. And Eli felt the weight of every year he'd lived since. Thomas vanished, settled onto his shoulders like a yoke. All the nights he'd dreamed of that face. All the times he'd avoided the sign because part of him already knew the truth. And as the creature waited patiently, the pasture growing quieter, expectant, Eli made the unthinkable decision, lowering his rifle, extinguishing the lantern with a gloved hand, plunging them both into a darkness so complete it felt like falling inward. And he stepped forward, telling Thomas, telling the thing that he was done running, that no one else would scream because of him again. And for the first time, the creature hesitated, its borrowed face flickering, because sacrifice offered freely carried a weight even it respected. And the land shuddered as the agreement rewrote itself, the darkness folding inward, consuming Eli's shape until there was nothing left but the sign standing alone under the moon, its letters subtly changed by morning, the burn marks deeper, the message clearer to those who knew how to read it. And weeks later, when travelers passed Black Hollow Ranch, they said the cattle were calm. The wind sounded normal again, and no one ever heard screaming from the north pasture anymore. But sometimes, just before dawn, if you stood close to the fence, you could swear you heard a man humming an old ranch tune, steady and watchful, keeping something far worse asleep beneath the ground. And if this story kept you listening to the very end, if you felt that chill settle in your chest as Eli made his choice, then don't walk away like everyone else did. Subscribe to the channel, because these are the stories that shouldn't be told, but must be heard.